So today I'm going to talk about using exercise to support people with experiences of sexual and partner violence. Again, I want to thank you all for choosing to sit in this presentation. I'm really excited about the work that I'm doing and so excited to talk about it with you all. First thing, I'm a federal employee, so I have to do some disclosures. I don't have any conflicts of interests, and this work is my own. It doesn't reflect the views of my employers. I'm supported by a postdoctoral fellowship, which is funded by the VA. So the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that today I'm going to be talking about sexual and partner violence in a very direct and objective way. It's really important when we talk about these things that we do it objectively. However, it can sometimes be hard, especially if you have a history of this form of violence, which we know from prevalence rates. It impacts a lot of people. So please take care of yourself, please be kind to yourself, and please be kind to others throughout the presentation. So first today I'm going to talk about my background. We'll do an introduction to sexual and partner violence and the need for integrative treatment options for people who have experienced this violence. Talk about exercise as an innovative treatment option for survivors, and then how I've been creating exercise spaces for survivors of sexual and partner violence. I want to start with a brief introduction. I assume most of you probably have not heard of me before. So this is just a little bit about my training and myself. I have a bachelor's degree in exercise science and a master's degree in exercise physiology, which I got from UNC Chapel Hill. I'm a big Tar Heel fan. It's probably not controversial here, but if I go to the Southeast, it's a controversial statement. So after I got my master's degree in exercise physiology, I started to work on an exercise trial, which was for older veterans with PTSD. This was my first introduction to working in exercise and mental health, and also for exercise and trauma specifically. It was a really, really great experience. So I saw a lot of veterans improve dramatically from the start of the intervention that I worked on to the end of the intervention. It really made an impact on me, and I really enjoyed working with the veterans. A couple of things that I noticed while I was working at that job. The first was there were a lot of women veterans who wanted to engage in that program, but there were a lot of barriers anecdotally that were told to me that prevented them from engaging in that exercise. The second one being, when I started doing work looking at the literature in this area, what I started to realize is when we're talking about exercise interventions for people who've experienced trauma, most of the interventions that we have currently are formatted specifically for male-dominated populations, which means that we don't have a lot of information on women specifically when it comes to exercise and trauma or PTSD. So these were a couple of things that I wanted to work on in my PhD. I decided to go back to school, and I got a PhD in community health from the University of Illinois, which I'm an Illini fan, which may be more controversial here. Being in Wisconsin, I don't know if you have strong opinions. But I worked with a psychologist there. She specialized in recovery for sexual and partner violence, so I got some advanced training there, as well as in behavioral sciences in general. Then for my PhD, I work as a postdoc currently in polytrauma, so I have advanced training in physical and psychological trauma at the VA with veterans. And I also work on the National Anti-Human Trafficking team, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute. So just to sum up, when we're talking about me and the things that I'm interested in, my research is kind of focused on three main areas: understanding the impact of trauma, how we can use exercise to help trauma survivors, and then how we can make exercises safe and trauma-informed. And when I talk about trauma here, I'm specifically talking usually about sexual and partner violence, and I'm usually talking about women. I work mostly with women in this space. So a little bit more about the context of what I do on a day-to-day basis. I'm currently a postdoc, and that means that I work on a lot of different research projects. So a lot of my work has been focused on understanding the impacts of physical and psychological trauma on women veterans while I've been at the VA. And my work on the National Anti-Human Trafficking team is kind of broader human services research, meaning looking at the VA, helping them collect data and decide if they should provide services for veterans who are experiencing trafficking and what that would look like. I also want to acknowledge a large part of my work is applying for funding and creating a space for myself in the field that I work in. So a large part of my postdoc has been applying for funds, and I'll talk you through a lot of the foundational work that I did to create the grant that I've been submitting and still working through. I also want to acknowledge that I do a lot of multidisciplinary work. So I've just included a couple of examples of organizations that I speak to. The first one being the American College of Sports Medicine, and the second one being the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies. If you can imagine, when I speak to both of these groups, I speak very differently. So if I'm talking to sports medicine folks, I'm talking to them and I'm educating them about trauma on a very basic level. If I'm talking to people from traumatic stress, I'm educating them about exercise on a very light level. So I do a lot of cross collaboration and talking to different types of people, and you'll probably notice that throughout my presentation. You'll also notice throughout my presentation, I feel very importantly and very strongly that working in trauma, you need to do some advocacy and education. We live in a world where trauma is really widespread, and we're having larger societal conversations about trauma. So it's really important we stay informed and we educate people about what trauma actually looks like. So you'll notice that when I speak as well. So to get into the science, I'm going to start off with some definitions so that we're all on the same page. The first thing I want to do is define sexual violence. This is per the CDC, which defines sexual violence as a sexual act that is committed or attempted without freely given consent of the victim or against someone who is unable to consent or refuse. This might be a little small for you, but I'll talk you through it. So these are prevalence rates across the lifetime of sexual violence among men and women. And so when we're talking about sexual violence, it's important to acknowledge too, there's physical violence and there's also psychological violence. Both of those things are included in this definition. So when we're talking about contact sexual violence, we're talking about things like rape, whether that be completed or attempted, those are both included, as well as things like unwanted sexual contact of any kind. When we combine those two categories and we look at lifetime prevalence, you'll see at the top, started in blue, the rate of contact sexual violence across the lifespan for women is almost 55%. When we look at men, that rate is just over 30%. When we look at more psychological forms of violence, these are things like sexual coercion or sexual harassment in a public place. These are marked by the green stars. These are also included in the definition of sexual violence, which is important to recognize. When we look at women, it's almost 24% have experienced sexual coercion in their lifetime, and over 30% have experienced sexual harassment in a public place. When we look at men, it's just about 11% for both of those types of violence. So a couple of things I want to acknowledge here. When we talk about these forms of violence, it's important to acknowledge women primarily are the ones who are experiencing this violence, and usually at the hands of men. So it's really important to acknowledge that too. Partner violence is related to sexual violence. This is the definition per the CDC. Any physical or sexual violence, stalking, and/or psychological aggression by a current or former dating partner or spouse. Prevalence of partner violence is also really high. It's almost 1 in 2 women, and 2 in 5 men report some form of partner violence across their life. Another thing to acknowledge here too, again, women are the ones who are primarily experiencing this violence, primarily at the hands of men. I wanted to talk about sexual and partner violence and what this looks like in a real world scenario, because oftentimes I think when we think about this, we think of somebody who's experiencing one form of violence and they kind of go the rest of their life recovering from that form of violence, but that's not generally what happens. So sexual and partner violence are often lifelong patterns that often are not disclosed to anybody in that person's life. I have an example of a woman here. She's going through her life marked with this gray arrow. So what you'll find usually happens is maybe in childhood, she'll be abused as a child. She'll exit that abuse. She'll be maybe abused as a young adult. She'll enter her first violent relationship. Maybe that will end. After that ends, she will enter another violent relationship. And that will go on for the rest of her life. That's usually what it looks like. It's not one type of violence that stops automatically. So this can have profound impacts on people. If you can imagine experiencing that throughout your entire life, constant trauma that you're dealing with and trying to talk to you about people, but it's really hard. Another thing that's really important that we make sure that we talk about is that oftentimes this violence is not disclosed to anybody in the person's life. So it's really hard to disclose this violence to people who you live with, healthcare providers, or anybody who you know. Oftentimes it gets told to nobody. So some of the barriers to disclosure of these forms of violence include often being a known perpetrator, involves intentional targeting. So these things make it really unsafe to talk to people about, or a healthcare provider, or a friend or family member. Maybe occurring early in development, so the person might not actually know what they're dealing with. Fear of not being believed, or negative past disclosure experiences. I want to make sure that we talk about negative disclosure experiences because they're so prevalent and because they're so important. And also important to acknowledge that negative disclosure experiences actually exacerbate outcomes, so it can make people feel worse about their experiences than they had before. So just a couple of examples of negative disclosure experiences. There are certainly more, but these are really important and, again, really common in today's society. The first one is untrue rape myths, which blame the victim. A couple of examples of this form of negative reaction are saying things like they were drunk, or she wore a short dress, he could have stopped her if he wanted to, or she just regrets sleeping with him. Again, these things and things like it are so prevalent in today's society, but they are really harmful and they make people feel worse about their experiences. The second one is making excuses for or justifying people who use violence. This also happens really frequently. A couple of examples: he doesn't mean anything by it, or he just hasn't been doing well recently, or it's her fault if she doesn't leave them. These are all false. These are all bad ways to react to someone telling you they've experienced something. And I think it's really important to acknowledge, again, because it exacerbates outcomes for the survivor if they hear this, but also we're all people who are going through our lives, publicly, professionally, personally. You know, there are so many stories in the news today. There was an awful story recently about an Olympic athlete, a woman who was brutally murdered by her partner recently. There's many examples in the US of this happening recently. It's really important to know this as people moving through the earth. We need to think about how we respond to people when they tell you something, or think about when you're reacting publicly to things. If you say things like this, it's gonna make things worse for survivors. So when I'm talking about the outcomes of sexual and partner violence, what am I talking about? Most times people think, when they think of partner and sexual violence, they think of PTSD. And that's a really good thought to have, because that is the thing that's most strongly associated with partner and sexual violence. But there are other things like anxiety and depression, which often happen at the same time as a PTSD diagnosis. There's also things that might not have a diagnosis, like emotion dysregulation or body image issues or disordered eating. Often at the same time as these mental health conditions, they're experiencing physical health conditions. So these are things like pain, cardiovascular disease, inflammatory disease, and functional impairment. I'll say pain is a really big deal for people who have experienced violence, and it's something that as exercise professionals, we need to acknowledge and work with. Psychosocial, again, I want to acknowledge that if you have not talked to anybody about the violence that you're experiencing, it's really stigmatizing, it's really isolating, it can have really negative psychosocial impacts. So these are things like social isolation, shame, stigma, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. So to get a better picture, you have to think about all these things, often co-occurring in people. It's not just one thing they're dealing with a lot of different things at once. And again, oftentimes it's really hard to get help, because oftentimes people don't talk about this with their care providers. The good thing is that there's been increasing recognition of the need for more integrative interventions for people who've experienced this form of violence. So again, I have our woman. She's going through her life here with a couple of traumatic experiences. If this person wants to find treatment, primarily what she's going to find now is mental health focused treatments. These are things like trauma focused therapy, cognitive behavioral therapies, or group therapy. And these things are great. We should encourage people to use them, should use them. They can be really, really helpful, but they're not perfect. There's definitely limitations to these treatments. So the first thing is high attrition, especially in trauma-focused therapy. It's really hard to talk about your trauma directly with a therapist. Stigma, logistical barriers, especially for women who often spend a lot of time caretaking, money, time, things like that. And even if you complete these treatments, oftentimes you still have things that are still bothering you after treatment completion. Another big thing to think about too is these mental health treatments are really focused on targeting mental health outcomes, which is good, but they're not really meant to address physical health conditions in your body that people might be experiencing. So the good news is, again, there's been increasing recognition of the prevalence of these forms of violence and the need for more treatments for people that can better address their complex health concerns. We see this represented. There's the US National Plan to End Gender-Based Violence that was initiated by Dr. Jill Biden, which has been allocating funds, time, and resources for people who want to make these integrative treatment options. And these are mirrored in things through the VA. There's a lot of increasing work in the VA focusing on women veterans who've experienced these forms of violence and how we can better serve them. So that's good news. So when we're talking about things that we can do to address a lot of these co-occurring conditions, thinking about exercise, there's so much opportunity to use exercise to improve a lot of these outcomes, or a lot of these domains that I mentioned. So these are the comorbidities that I mentioned the first time around. These are things that people deal with. The really good news is when we're looking at the general population, we have evidence to support that exercise improves all of these things, which is great. We don't have as much evidence specifically in people who've experienced partner and sexual violence, which is something that we need to improve on. Another really good thing is we have a lot of research on people who have experienced PTSD. So there's a lot of fantastic researchers here that will talk to you more about PTSD specifically. But there's this kind of new and flourishing research base which supports that exercise can reduce PTSD symptoms. It can address a lot of functional impairment associated with PTSD. It can improve comorbid anxiety and depression. So these things are really great too. It's all encouraging. When we're talking about partner and sexual violence, we only have data on a couple of outcomes. So these include these START outcomes. So it's really small. It's anxiety, depression, emotion dysregulation, and social isolation, which are important. But again, there's not much evidence focused on the specific population, so we need more evidence. Another thing that I wanted to mention too is in a lot of qualitative work that I've done among survivors who were physically active, people generally acknowledge that exercise makes them feel strong and in control of their bodies, which is a really big thing to think about when we're talking about people who experience sexual and partner violence. One of the hallmarks of those types of trauma is they don't feel in control of their bodies. So giving people bodily autonomy is really important. So acknowledging bodily autonomy, that's a hard thing to capture in a questionnaire or a traditional mental health outcome. So I want to acknowledge that exercise has a positive effect on a wide range of outcomes, and so that's really good. And it should be considered an intervention that's transdiagnostic, meaning it can address multiple issues at one time with one intervention, which is great. If we want to create exercise interventions, we have to make sure that people come to the exercise interventions. Otherwise, what's the point of telling people to exercise if we don't support them? So a lot of my work is developing exercise interventions and trying to figure out how we can do this the best way so that people will actually show up. So this is a study that I did. It was a questionnaire of 355 women survivors of sexual violence, and we were asking them about their barriers to engaging in exercise, which was before this not really widely studied. So when we asked them about their barriers to exercise, the highest ranked barriers that we got from this questionnaire, meaning the things that people said the most, were hard physical exercise, meaning that they felt like they didn't want to exert themselves. Poor exercise environments, meaning they felt uncomfortable in exercise environments, and not having enough time. I have a couple of qualitative quotes here to just help demonstrate those ideas a little bit more. So the first one, I need to exercise, but I'm in pain all of the time. Pain is a really big issue. There are a lot of psychosomatic conditions among women who experience violence who have vague pain diagnoses that are really unaddressed in our healthcare system. So pain's a really big deal. The second one, I get nervous going for walks or runs by myself. I feel like something bad will happen. Safety is really important. I'll come back to this and talk about it more, but people generally feel unsafe if you've experienced partner or sexual violence in exercise settings. And the third one, mental health makes it difficult to exercise and stick with it. So mental health is a big concern, and motivating people with mental health conditions is something we need to think about when working with this group. I want to talk more about safety. It's the most important part for people who've experienced partner and sexual violence because exercise really hasn't been safe for these folks for a very long time. And so we need to acknowledge that moving forward. So how do you make spaces safe? The biggest way we can do that is incorporating trauma-informed and gender-sensitive spaces. This is some background information on what that actually means. I could give an entire 45-minute presentation on trauma-informed care. It's a broad framework, but the general idea is recognizing that people who've experienced trauma actually did experience that trauma, and then trying to make a safe place, acknowledging the experiences that they've had. So there's a lot of ways you can do this. One of the most foundational ways of doing this is involving the voices of stakeholders as you develop programs. It's really important, and it's not always widely done currently. And we know that it works. So trauma-informed care in healthcare settings, there's really good evidence. It works. It reduces barriers to care, it increases satisfaction with care, and it improves health outcomes. It works in healthcare settings. We need to use it in exercise. Gender sensitivity as a construct is inherent in trauma-informed care. I think that it's helpful to think about this in the context of partner and sexual violence. If we acknowledge that this is being done primarily to women by men, it means that women approach services quite differently, and they feel differently in healthcare settings than you might impact because of the presence of men generally. So gender-sensitive approaches for survivors are integrated a lot into mental health care, and what that evidence shows us is that women survivors are less likely to engage in gender-mixed groups. They report strong preferences for same-gendered providers, and they often feel male-dominated spaces are unwelcoming. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the survey that I did to kind of demonstrate some of these points. So this was a survey that we did, 355 women survivors of sexual violence. We asked them questions about their interest in exercise programs and then what those programs would look like. So the first question, would you be interested in an exercise program designed to improve well-being among women survivors of sexual violence? With the key part being here, designed to improve well-being among women survivors of sexual violence, so a tailored intervention that they knew would be safe. Most folks say yes, some folks say maybe, and just 5% said no. When we're talking about what that exercise intervention would look like, flexible exercise locations, meaning that some people prefer to go into a gym, some people prefer to have an online intervention. Especially when we're talking about women, it's really important to acknowledge it can be hard to commute. People may not have money to commute, they might not have time, they'll be taking care of kids, so having an online option is always great. Having women exercise instructors, exercising 3 to 4 times a week and at moderate intensities. When I was doing this work, I was really interested in comparing to see if women who screened positive for PTSD had different preferences from women who might not have had as severe mental health symptoms. And what we found was that women survivors with PTSD were more strongly interested in programs, meaning that this first question, they were more likely to say yes to and less likely to say no to. And they were more likely to have a strong preference for same-gendered providers. So again, thinking about gender-sensitive care, it's really important if we want people to engage in programs. So what we have seen across the research, that survey indicated that many women were really interested in programs that were designed for them. I've done a lot of work in this space. Whenever I survey or ask somebody if they're interested in a program designed for survivors, they generally say yes. So over 90% of women say yes to being interested in programs that were made for them. Within the space of exercise for partner and sexual violence, again, it's small, but it's supported by research that women in these programs generally like being surrounded with women that have similar experiences to them. That's really important. And research emphasizes creating exercise interventions that are accessible and flexible. Again, accessibility, especially for women who have really challenging schedules, and flexibility are really important, especially for women. So when I talk about the current programs, some of the limitations that we have, again, there are very few programs that are actually tailored for this group. These programs generally focus on things like walking or yoga. Walking and yoga are great. They don't cover all the preferences that women have. Not all women want to do walking and yoga, so we should offer more things. These programs as well, a lot of them focus on veterans, which is also really great, but a lot of them are really targeted for people who've experienced military sexual trauma, which by definition is sexual trauma which is experienced during the military. Which we should acknowledge that if you experience sexual trauma, it's not necessarily just during one time in your life, it's across your lifespan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some pilot information that I've been gathering at the VA to support my grant applications. On developing and testing tailored exercise program for women veterans with histories of sexual violence. And before I do that, I just want to give a little bit of a background on women veterans as a population so we understand a little bit who we're talking about here. Women veterans as a group disproportionately experience sexual and partner violence before, during, and after military service. So it's important to acknowledge all 3 of those time points. A lot of times people think about military sexual trauma. Military sexual trauma rates right now, what we know is it's over 50%. So it's a really big problem while you're in the service. But again, really big to acknowledge that it also happens before and after military service. Trauma experienced while you're in the military, if that's something that's happened to you, is also a bit unique from other trauma types, because as a woman veteran, you're enrolled in this organization, you're supposed to protect yourself, you're supposed to protect others, you're supposed to protect your country, and if you've been abused while you're in that system, it can feel like a really intense form of betrayal. So that's really challenging for folks. And on top of that, if there's not often justice that gets taken in those situations. So it can be really, really hard. And this is certainly true among civilian populations, but it's extra true for women veterans because they live in a context where they're surrounded by male veterans most of the time when they're in the service. Women veterans also navigate male-dominated spaces and are more likely to distrust VA providers, again, partially because of this institutional betrayal that they experience being in a system that hasn't always listened to or validated their experiences. So when we're talking about exercise for veterans, there's actually a lot of work that's being done that's offered for veterans in the exercise space for mental health. I want to acknowledge some of them. So the first one is SteriFit. It's a nationwide program. It's for older veterans. It's really great. A lot of good stuff happening in that program, and a lot of veterans really like it. Whole Health exists. This is a program that's nationwide through the VA. It has exercise programs available within it. That's been really great. And there's also a lot of research when we're talking about exercise and PTSD. One of the biggest producers of this work is the VA. There's a lot of really robust research in this area from the Veterans Health Administration, which is great. However, when we're talking about these programs, none of these are really tailored for women veterans. Again, we know gender-sensitive care is so important for women veterans because they often don't feel validated. So having spaces specifically for women veterans is important, but we don't have any of those currently. And again, most of this work is focused on military sexual trauma, so trauma just happening during the military service, not acknowledging that people have lifetime experiences of sexual trauma, which is important. So some of this work that I've been doing among women veterans, I'm going to share some of it. I work for a longitudinal cohort study, which means that we constantly have veterans coming in and doing really robust assessments of their physical and mental health. And so what I've been doing is women who come through, since I've been working, we ask them questions about exercise, and then I offer them an optional questionnaire about exercise programs for women veterans, and then I have a qualitative interview that I do with any woman who wants to. So I'm going to talk through some data from that here. The first thing I want to do is acknowledge the demographics of the sample. So these women were about 39 years on average. They're primarily white and non-Hispanic. It's almost 84% of them had a lifetime history of PTSD, and half of them had a lifetime TBI. So most women veterans from the sample, to start with, when they answered a questionnaire about their physical activity levels, it's 70% of women veterans were not active per public health guidelines, which specify 75 to 150 moderate to vigorous minutes of exercise a week, which is recommended for general health improvements. So of the 10 women that we had that filled out the questionnaire, all of them said that they were very interested in an exercise program tailored for women veterans. The interest, again, it's there, just the programs aren't there. And then when we asked about types of exercise, again, you'll remember I said a lot of programs right now are walking or yoga. Women veterans are interested in diverse exercise programs. They want to do more things. They don't just want to do walking and yoga. They also want to weightlift. They also want to do high-intensity intervals. They also want to box. They want to do CrossFit. They want to cycle. They want to climb. They want to do a lot of different things. Some of the qualitative information that we're getting, which is really rich and interesting, I'll talk us through this. So some of the facilitators that we have are physical and mental health promotion. So women veterans acknowledge generally that exercise will improve their physical and mental health, and that motivates them. They also think that coaches would be helpful. So if you just tell a women veteran to exercise, they're going to want more support. We keep hearing them say, we want people who can help us. I want someone I can ask a question to. I want that to be a person. Social connection with other women veterans is really important. Again, women veterans are a minority. It's really important to create spaces where they feel seen and they can connect with other people that are similar to them. And then also gender sensitivity. Again, creating women-only spaces are really important for this group. So some quick quotes to help demonstrate these. First one, physical health, mental health, social, exercise helps all three. Second one, someone that can help you and who you could ask about stuff, that would be helpful. Again, they need coaches or people to help them. The third one, I'd be so excited if there was a program for women veterans that I could connect and exercise with. Again, it's like repeatedly women want this, but we're just not offering it. Some of the barriers, the lack of tailored programs and pain and injury. Pain and injury is such a big deal. And again, the lack of programs is a really big deal. So some quotes to help demonstrate this. For women veterans like myself with PTSD, it's a safety issue. I wouldn't feel safe with men there. Again, gender sensitivity is important. Quote, a lot of things seem to be geared towards older male veterans. Again, we're getting to lack of programs and lack of gender-sensitive spaces. And the third, I'm concerned that I will need help. I don't want to put myself into a pain flare-up. Again, people who've experienced this form of violence experience such vague pain conditions, and they're really not well addressed by the healthcare system, so there's no reason for these people to think that exercise could help unless we tell them that and we help them through the pain conditions. That's important. I want to make sure that we talk, again, I've talked a lot about safety. These are very real things that women veterans are dealing with in real time. There's not easy answers to a lot of the things women are dealing with as they're trying to engage in exercise and take care of their health. So this quote I'll read, quote, I'm going through a tough divorce with a very horrible man. I have a restraining order from him. I just started walking again 2 weeks ago. I just started feeling comfortable walking by my home again, but I don't even leave the property. I'd like to work back up to go to the point where I can back in the gym, but I need to feel safe. Again, this is a very real scenario that women are dealing with. They might not tell you they're dealing with it, but they're dealing with it. And again, there's not really a simple answer as to how we address this. So in this scenario, this woman veteran had literally printed out a picture of her partner and given it to all of the gym staff so they knew what he looked like, so that they could be aware if he came onto the property that they would call the authorities pretty much. But these are very real things. If we want to work in populations that are experiencing trauma, we have to know how to deal with them. So there's not really an easy answer to this. The things that I talk about with my colleagues of how to do this best in a research setting is creating safety plans, making sure that we have a psychologist available, sharing local and national resources with people, creating open lines of communication. Again, a lot of people don't talk about this. We have to be open to talking about this, and also trauma-informed tailoring and training for people who are implementing these interventions is really important. So I've talked you through a lot of work that I've done in order to create a foundational work to apply for grants to kind of build these programs. You have to do this before you apply for grants. And it's really important with this that if you want to create programs for people who are experiencing violence, you need to have dedicated time, money, and resources for that. You can't just do this as a hobby and think it's going to go well. So we're in the midst of applying for funding, and I have a question mark because even if you have a great grant score right now, funding is pretty precarious, so you're not guaranteed to have money for that. But anyway, so working through this, even if after you start doing programs, you still have to get feedback from providers and people who you're working with to continually improve your programs and make them applicable for the folks you're working with. Feasibility, acceptability testing, efficacy testing, and clinical implementation. Those are 3 bullet points, but that's like multiple careers. So there's a lot of work to be done in this area. A quick summary and lessons learned. So exercise can improve physical, mental, and psychosocial impacts of sexual and partner violence. It's really good. There's a lot of opportunity, and it's really exciting. But when we use it, we have to think about incorporating trauma-informed and gender-sensitive approaches. Throughout this process, centering the voices of survivors, the voices, safety, and autonomy of survivors is the most important thing. That should come above everything else. Just some quick lessons learned from me as a person and a researcher, and if you're interested in this field, we should talk more about this because there's a lot I've learned. But to try to summarize it, it's really hard to facilitate clinical and research connections. It's also really hard to facilitate research-to-research connections for people who work in different fields. It's a really interesting skill that I've had to learn on the fly, but it's really important. Survivors all have different backgrounds and interests, and it's important to acknowledge and honor all of these. And also speaking out against these forms of violence is important and challenging. I will emphasize challenging. People always have different responses when you talk about violence. So if you want to work in this area, I would acknowledge that it can be hard. There's a lot of future directions. The first one I want to acknowledge is that we need more people working in this area because we need to address a lot of diversity that's needed. We need people with outcomes for men. We need people with diverse gender identities. We need racial and ethnic minorities. We need a lot of work to be done. So that's the first thing I'll say. We need more types of exercise to be tested, diverse outcomes. We need to understand how best to make these places safe. That's still in the works. And I wanted to make sure I included some reflections. Again, I know at the start I did a lot of education on violence. Some people think about this, some people don't think about this on a day-to-day basis. So I try to think about these questions as a researcher and a person on a consistent basis, just to make myself a little bit better. So just something to think about. These are not meant to put you on the spot, but they are meant to make you think about your life a little bit. So the first one, how do you think survivors feel participating in your research or practice? Can you make your spaces safer or more inclusive? And can you improve how you speak or think about people experiencing violence? With that, thanks all for listening, and I have a couple minutes for questions. So.
Excellent job.
Truly an excellent job, Michelle. And this is such a massive issue. I'll tell you, as a domestic violence prosecutor in Cook County, this is the second largest county in the country. Domestic violence, the type of crime, is the number one type of crime that occurs in all. 6 million plus people in this county, and underreported, and there are many vets who are these victims. So let's open this up to questions at this time. Any questions? Okay, well, I have a question.
Great.
What did you find the most challenging part about your research when speaking with these victims? I know you mentioned earlier that these victims often only want to speak to, people who have felt similar stories or circumstances. Did you find any difficulty communicating with them or them opening up at all?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing also as an academic. You move around a lot from institution to institution. So as a researcher, you have to build trust with the people you're working with. I'm really lucky to work with an organization that has really great relationships with women veterans, and they feel really safe and acknowledged in the setting that we work in. So even us, a lot of veterans will go in and they might not even be asked about partner violence or sexual violence when they go into the VA. Even if they were asked, they might not disclose, but even acknowledging that those things happen isn't a given. It's often just not acknowledged at all. And so I think, people are oftentimes afraid to talk about this, but we shouldn't be afraid. We should be talking about it more and understanding more so we can help people. So I've benefited from a lot of the robust relationships that have existed before me as a researcher. And I think just continually doing outreach and showing that you care about communities that you work with is really important. So, thanks, Sam. Either one.
I would love some ideas on how we can do gender-specific, gender-sensitive classes or programming, and also being thoughtful, being gender-inclusive, so that we can be welcoming of spaces that are needed without being insensitive at the same time.
Yeah, so the question was, how can we make gender-sensitive spaces that are also inclusive? My biggest thought would be to ask the people you're trying to reach what they would like. So that would be the first thing, is to say, a lot of gyms too, it's really good if gyms can offer just a women's only hour, and then you could have everybody else coming, so you're not forced into a women only space if you don't want to be. But as far as people who are gender diverse, I think it's a really good question, one that I don't have a great answer to, but also one that I would think would be a great question to ask folks who you want to work with, because again, it's really important to acknowledge those folks too. Thanks.
Let's do these two questions.
Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for the work that you do. I am a woman veteran, and I got out of the service in 2021. I spent 12 years in the United States Army, and when I was deployed, I was one of 2 females who was on an outpost. One of the things that I recognized as well as I was overseas is that they did offer behavioral health interventions, but they were never available when we needed them because of being on mission for at least 12 hours a day. And so when you had someone come to your post, they might be there for a week, they might be there for 2, but they might be there at the hours that you were on mission. So then we didn't have the opportunity. From being in the service, I've also lost a friend to domestic violence in 2019. And oftentimes, like you're saying, the threats that we anticipate are not always the threats that we face. And so when you face that betrayal of another service member or someone that you're close to, or the betrayal of leadership at that point too, if someone is brave enough to speak up. It influences everyone to not speak. And so I think in recent times, the VA has become a more welcoming place to veterans, whereas before veterans wouldn't speak up for a multitude of reasons. I do kind of wonder if there could be like a crisis response team for female veterans, or for any veterans who are experiencing domestic violence of some sort, because we do have these crisis teams in the civilian world, if you will, but maybe not specific to female veterans or to veterans who are experiencing crises outside of a term of service, if you will. I'm wondering if that's ever been talked about as far as having like a response team, and what it looks like potentially to have something smaller where we don't have to go to the VA. Oftentimes too, there's transportation difficulties. There's very few VAs if you look at the entire state. And then we have certain like CBOCs and things like that, right, where we can access in more rural locations. I don't know, I'm not sure I'm articulating a question very well, but.
You're doing great.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, first I want to say thanks for being here and thanks for coming and thanks for your comments. I really appreciate it and I'm glad to have you here. So your point about the crisis teams, so what I'll say about VA, and you might have a different opinion, I think women are the fastest growing subpopulation of veterans, so they're growing quickly. And I think that VA has really tried to offer more diverse services for people, whether or not you think that's successful. I do think there's been growth within VA as acknowledging this and making efforts to make better services. As far as a crisis management, I think it's a great idea. I don't know what the VA is doing, but I think it would be worthwhile to pursue that. But yeah, I'm not sure about that's happening, but it would be a great idea. And again, just acknowledging that these things happen. I work a lot in TBI, and in a lot of spaces in TBI and in the VA, they don't even acknowledge partner violence as a contributor to TBIs. So there's very simple things that they could do to improve, to validate experiences. But that's not really a great answer either, but yeah, thanks. I appreciate your comment.
Hi, my name is Eric Adrian. I'm a United States Marine Corps veteran, combat veteran. I had the honor to be in Washington, D.C. this summer before Congress went on their hiatus. And I would like to read you and see your stance. I got to meet with Commissioner Calla, and I was working with, we produced a bipartisan letter. As you know, between 17 and 44 veterans take their lives each day, and nearly 150,000 veterans have done so since 9/11. It's 21 times as many Americans' lives lost in war zones over the same time. PTSD and suicide have been exponentially more lethal than those who have served in uniform and combat. So up there, I noticed that you had a couple of slides where you said we were at 30 and 50%. I was at 100% PTSD until I was a part of this test subject of the MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD, which I'm now in zero. So now the billions of dollars spent is not being spent on me, as you can imagine. So what was passed is that this, in phase 3 confirmation trials, 71.2% of participants no longer qualified for PTSD diagnosis after 3 8-hour sessions of MDMA-assisted therapy. Moreover, 86.5% of participants experienced clinically significant improvements in their PTSD. This is the first advancement we've had in 25 years for PTSD. And now it's been shot down again by the FDA. Not their fault, it's like those had some problems. How is the VA going to set this up? Because when talking with Commissioner Calla, he's all for it, and he wants to know how are we going to move forward with setting up these assisted facilities stateside versus me and my 1,800 of us who have gone overseas for this psychosis therapy. So my question is to you, being forward in the VA, how are you going to, how are you guys moving forward with this? obviously you know the results of the MDMA. And I'll sit down and take my answer.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah. First, I want to just acknowledge and thank you for the comment, and thanks for sharing your experience. The question was about MDMA and PTSD treatment. And again, I'm not quite an expert in this area. I do know that there's a lot of really good outcomes on psychedelic drugs and PTSD, and that's something that actually our group is working on, applying for multiple grants in that area. From my experience working in the VA, there's been growth in that area. I will say I'm definitely not an expert, but I will say also my colleague James Whitworth will talk more about the military experience and PTSD, so I'd encourage you. James, you're at 4? He speaks at 4 p.m. He's in the back there. He's also really great, and he's also a veteran, would be a great person to chat with as well. But yeah, I would say just thank you for your experience, and I similarly hope that anything we can do to help people with PTSD would be supported, but I don't know all the details of that exactly.